now we're going to talk about who versus whom. This can seem really tricky, but once you know what to do and how to approach these questions, they're actually super easy. Because we do have one rule, one trick that works every time. This is the he/him test. So basically what you're going to be doing is you're going to be given a statement and you're turning it into a question and then answering that question. And I'll show you what I mean. So here's our example sentence. I am a person who will shop for hours if time allows. So we're going to use this who/whom sentence, or we don't know which one we're using, turn it into a question. So the question is, who will shop for hours? We're going to answer that question. If we answer it with he, she, they, it, or her, and then if we answer with he, she, it, or they, then our correct answer is who to be used in that sentence. If we answer it with him, her, or them, the M words, then the M, whom, works in that sentence. If it's easier for you to just think of it as he or him, that works too, but just if you want to memorize the list of these that work for who and these that work for whom, you can do that as well.
Yes. So this is just basically another way of looking at what Hayden was saying in table form. So if you answer the question with he, she, or they, or just he for simplicity, you're going to use who. But if you answer with him, them, or her, the M's, once again, if you can just use him and he, it's going to be a lot easier. Then you're going to use whom. So for example, Annabelle is a student who will write the letter. We cut it off right there and say, okay, who will write the letter? You would say he or she will write the letter, right? So in that case, you'd use who, not whom. Another example, I do not know whom to vote for. Cut it off, say, whom should I vote for? You would say, I should vote for him, not I should vote for he. So in that case, whom is correct. If you don't like the he/him test, another way of thinking about who versus whom is kind of more grammatical, more technical, but if that works for you, that's awesome. So who is used to introduce a phrase or a clause. So for example, she was the woman who started the company. In this case, we would use who because we're introducing that phrase, and it's describing she. However, whom functions as a direct object. So for example, he is the teacher for whom I taught. In this case, whom is a direct object of that preposition for, so it's correct in that sentence.
There is an exception to this rule, just keep it in mind. With modifiers like all of, many of, most of, just remember whom is always going to be used. So we see these example sentences. The girls, all of whom were wearing blue, arrived at school, or the dogs, many of whom ate peanut loved the cookies. So all of these are, you can think of it as, like Jenna said at the bottom of the last slide, whenever the who or whom is acting as a direct object, the whom should be used and is correct, and these examples, they're acting as the object of the preposition. So same sort of thing, and that's why that is correct. When we look at this one, I don't know in whom I trust, I don't know with whom I'm meeting. These are more examples of prepositional phrases, and that's why the object of the preposition, whom, is correct.
Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and go through a sample question together. This one reads, it was exhausting to spend every day in the hot summer temperature while pretending to be a person whom had lived in a different country and century. So we need to figure out, are we using who or are we gonna use whom here? So we're gonna follow our process, cut the sentence off, say who had lived in a different country and century. And you would say he had lived in a different country and century, right? Not him had lived in a different country and century. Because you answer with he, you know that you have to use who, not whom there. So it's going to be either B or D. And in this case, it's going to be answer choice D because B, who were to live, just messes with verb tense, kind of creates a more confusing sentence. So when in doubt, go for the more concise, clear answer, and that's going to be D in our case. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about with usage is ambiguous and vague pronouns. Basically, pronouns have to clearly refer to a specific noun. A pronoun is ambiguous and vague when it is unclear what noun the pronoun stands for. In other words, you have to have a super clear specific antecedent. If more than one noun could possibly be the antecedent, like if there's any question about which noun it is, don't use a pronoun, just go ahead and use a specific noun to make sure your sentence is clear.
Here's an example of what Jenna was talking about with this sentence. Despite the fact that the car hit the lamppost, it was not disfigured. We're not sure if that it is referring to the car or the lamppost because both make sense in that context. Despite the fact that the car hit the lamppost, the car was not disfigured, the lamppost was not disfigured. It could be either one, so we just need to choose one specific noun so that there's no room for confusion. You would have to use the context of the passage to know which one is right, but in this case, we're going to say that the lamppost was not disfigured. So our correct sentence, despite the fact that the car hit the lamppost is not disfigured. There's no confusion. It's super clear. No room for confusion.
Okay, so we're gonna walk through this sample question together. It reads, once Hurt catches up to Lily, the retriever points her nose directly at the woad. Hurt can then find the 1-inch tall plant, pulling it up as she watches, anticipating her reward. So for context, woad is a type of plant. It's like a weed, and they're searching for those plants. So we have a couple answer choices here. One is she watches, he or she watches, Lily watches, or you watch. Now this is a key to finding ambiguous and vague pronouns. If you see a question like this where you're given a couple different pronoun choices and then one specific noun for your answer, it's going to be an ambiguous and vague question most likely. And when in doubt, pick the specific noun. Here, we'd want to say Lily watches because it makes it clear that the retriever Lily is watching her pull up the plant. He or she, you, and she also all leave confusion. It could be Hurt watching, it could be Lily watching, and it's not going to be you because the passage isn't referring directly to the reader. So in that case, we want to use that specific noun, Lily, to avoid any confusion.
Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about in this PowerPoint are idioms. And idioms are not, on the ACT, might not be exactly what you were taught maybe in school. It's not things like hit the hay or raining cats and dogs. Instead, it's going to be words that work together, such as, for example, between and between the cat and the dog. We'd always use those two, and you wouldn't say like between the cat or the dog. As and as good as, either or, and neither nor. You always use those together. So it's just really remembering which words kind of go in place. These are some good ones to memorize. Just know that like those will always go together and not a closely related word, like just like as versus or can be kind of tricky sometimes, things like that. So just memorize these and know when to recognize them on the test.
Yes. Okay, so there are two main types of idiom questions asked on the SAT and the ACT. The first one, they're going to have you pick the correct preposition. So you're only going to have to work with the preposition. For example, the rain trickled, underlined portion, the wall. So you just have to ask yourself, what preposition would go here? What would I say in normal speech? Something that really helps me is try to picture like a more simple situation, like in everyday life, where I might use the preposition or use that phrase that they're asking me about. So here we'd want to put down, so the rain trickled down the wall would make the most sense. And the second type of question is they're going to have you pick the correct idiomatic expression. Like Hayden was saying, this isn't really like hit the hay, it's raining cats and dogs. It's more like the examples that she was giving, either or, neither nor, etc. This is a little bit more complicated because it may have a preposition in it. It's not just picking the correct preposition. So, for example, she wanted neither the cookies, underlined portion, the cake. You would have to recognize that since you have neither here, you have to use nor, you shouldn't use or, because neither nor go together as an idiom. So basically with idioms, it's more about what sounds right and not grammatical rules about which ones are right. So when you're coming face to face with an idioms question, just try to think about what you would say in normal speech, because that's most likely going to be right.
So we're going to go through a sample question together. This one says, his qualifying entry time lagged almost a full minute above the world record time held by Australian Ron Clark. Our underlined word is above, and we can see it's around, behind, from. So again, not really asking about grammar, this is more about what sounds right. And when we look at the beginning of the sentence, his qualifying entry time lagged. So that means it's behind. He's slower than the other people. So why would he be almost a full minute above the world record holder? If he's lagging, he's slower and he's behind. So that's why our correct answer for this one is not going to be A. It's not going to be around the world record holder. It's not going to be from, but it's going to be behind the world record time because it's behind, it's lagging. Look at the context, and that's just what sounds right in this sentence too, if you need to think of it that way. Sometimes idioms are tricky like that, where there's no real way that you can say, this is the concrete reason why this is this way. It's just knowing what words are right. That's the way to make these questions super tricky, and just more practice is what's going to help you on these.